Welcome to ECCB Connects, a production of the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, where we share with you who we are, what we do, and how we serve you. Have you ever wondered what influences the price of gasoline at the pump? What about why the price of fuel varies from supplier to supplier or from country to country? In this episode, Economist in the Research, Statistics and Data Analytics Department at the ECCB, Bullen, discusses what influences the price of fuel and the pricing mechanisms that governments use to determine what you pay at the pump. Stay connected. We'll share more with you after this message.
The future is here. Everybody must be aware. The cash taking easy digital. You don't need to use money physically. You could use your phone to send, receive, and so much more. The cash safe and faster, cheaper, so get it up on your mobile phone. Everybody rolling now with the cash. Everybody rolling now with the cash. Everybody rolling now with the cash. We spending easy dollars digitally. Rolling now with the cash. Everybody rolling now with the cash. Everybody rolling now with the cash. We spending easy dollars digitally.
The EC dollar is digital. Make payments safer, faster, and cheaper with Dcash.
Leon, welcome to ECCB Connects.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, energy is the lifeblood of an economy. It's the ability to do work. And a big part of energy is fuel. In this sense, I'm speaking about fossil fuels, the gasoline, LPG, diesel, etc. It touches all aspects of our lives. And because we are small countries that don't produce these fossil fuels on our own, we have to import. And of course, there's a price to pay for this fuel. What influences the cost of fuel generally for us?
So the most important determinant would be the cost of crude oil on international markets. And we basically use the Brent crude oil as the benchmark, international benchmark.
And Brent crude oil?
Brent crude oil, right? There's something called a WTI, West Texas Intermediate, which is also another major benchmark, but the international benchmark it refers to the Brent crude oil. And currently, Brent is trading at about $82 per barrel. At its peak last year, it traded at $133 per barrel. So just from that, you can tell that there's going to be a tremendous difference in prices that we would face on the domestic markets, just based on the international price of crude. So that's the first determinant. Wholesalers and retailers have to they get a margin, right? A wholesale margin and retail margin. So those also constitute part of the price buildup for gasoline and diesel. And of course, the governments do make some revenue from the purchase and sale of gasoline and diesel and other fuel products. So there's a consumption tax that is levied on the fuel. So these are the main components of the price of fuel on the domestic markets.
Now, going back to the Brent benchmark, and you spoke about the fluctuation in prices, for example, over the past year. Talk to us about what are some of the factors that influence that fluctuation in price?
Okay, so in the case of the international benchmarks, the main determinant of the fluctuations in the last year would be the war in Ukraine, right? Russia is a major supplier of oil to the global markets. And once Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a huge amount of uncertainty throughout the global economy. And once there's uncertainty, prices become very volatile. And of course, sanctions were placed on Russia. And so countries were no longer importing Russian oil. And so as a result, there was a shortage of oil on the world market. So the supply decreased while the demand was still very high. And so when you have a mismatch between supply and demand, prices go up. And so that was the main determinant of the spike in oil prices that we saw on the international markets. And of course, that fed into the domestic prices.
So geopolitics plays a key part of what we actually pay for oil. Now, in the region, we observe, and some of us know, from country to country, there is a difference in the cost of fuel, whether, like I said, it's LPG or it's gasoline. From St. Kitts to St. Lucia, St. Vincent to Grenada, there's a difference in pricing. Why is there a difference in pricing from country to country and sometimes from supplier to supplier?
So I will start off with the wholesale and retail margins that I just spoke about. Wholesalers and retailers have different margins across the different islands. And that has to do, in the case of wholesalers, it has to do with their internal costs. So for instance, transporting fuel in Dominica is a much more expensive venture than transporting fuel in St. Kitts and Nevis or Antigua, when these countries are relatively flat. And so the cost to the wholesalers is much higher in Dominica, and as a result, they charge a higher wholesale margin. Retailers also charge a margin as well, and it varies across islands. Basically, the wholesalers and retailers negotiate with the governments for any increases or changes in their margins, and the governments would either agree to their requests or not. So the margins are an essential component. But I think the biggest factor is the consumption tax that government levies on the product. Consumption taxes range from as low as $2.50 to over $4 across the islands. And governments, based on their needs, on their fiscal needs, they will determine what consumption tax is appropriate for them. And so it's an individual decision that governments make for their countries based on their fiscal needs. And so these are some of the major costs. So of course there is the international price of crude, which feeds into domestic prices. But you also have the margins, as I stated, as well as the consumption tax that governments levy.
Leon, you spoke about suppliers of the fuel. In our context, are these suppliers regional or are they government controlled?
So the suppliers are mainly private entities, right? They contract to receive shipments of oil from either, say, Trinidad or from the U.S. Virgin Islands and other sources, sometimes from Venezuela. So they are private entities that are regulated by the government. But the governments do not supply oil in this region. They regulate it, and they also attach a consumption tax in order to get some revenue from the sale of the product.
Leon, when some of us look at the news or we go online, we see different prices for oil, gasoline reflected on the international scale. But then when we actually do the mathematics, we are seeing a difference at the pump or what we pay for a cylinder of gasoline. What influences the actual retail price, and why is there sometimes a difference in what we see this morning for the price of oil as to oppose what we would see when we actually go to purchase it?
Part of it depends on the storage capacity of the islands. So in the case of St. Kitts and Nevis, for instance, I think it probably has storage capacity for maybe up to 3 to 4 weeks, right? So it means a shipment comes in every 3 to 4 weeks to replenish what would have been sold during the preceding period. And when that shipment comes in, the price of oil on the international markets at that point in time would be the relevant price that would feed through the domestic prices. So as new shipments come in, the prices will vary based on the international benchmarks. As I mentioned, the Brent crude oil would be the main international benchmark. So that's one thing. But also, the prices get fed through immediately to the domestic prices in the case of St. Kitts and Nevis and Montserrat. They have what we call a full pass-through system. So whatever the prices are on the international markets, they are felt immediately in St. Kitts and Nevis. Basically, what the suppliers do is that they average the cost of the new product that would have been imported with the existing stocks that they have on island, and they feed that average price through to the consumers immediately. So in the case of Grenada, Dominica, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, they use a partial moving average system, whereby in the case of Grenada and Dominica, they use the average of the last 4 weeks of prices on the international markets, and they feed that through to the domestic prices. So the benefit of that is when prices are rising rapidly, the consumers don't see the full effect of the rapid rise in prices. Because you use the average of the last 4 weeks.
Okay.
So whereas the price should be, say, really $20, if you use the average of the last 4 weeks, it might be like $17 or $16, $17 to the consumer. Now when the prices start to go down, you also use the average. So the price really should be, say, $16 based on the current price of oil. But because using the average of the last 4 weeks, it might be about $18 to the consumer. But it does move in the right direction. So the benefit of that is that it smooths large fluctuations in prices, and it makes it much more palatable, if you will, to the consumer. So you don't face these large jolts in prices either on the upswing or the downswing. So it has a very good smoothing effect to the consumer, and it does send the right signals that, hey, prices are increasing, and so you may have to reduce your consumption or be a bit more efficient with how you use your energy.
Now, as you spoke about the fluctuations, do our governments have, in terms of their regulation, is there a cap on how much they allow for the market to fluctuate, how much a customer ends up paying for this fuel?
Governments have, they can use their discretion, right? In the case of Grenada, for instance, last year, they put a cap of $15 per gallon on gasoline because prices were increasing rapidly. And we know that inflation was spiking throughout all these countries and throughout the world. And so one of the policy measures that they took was to put a cap on gasoline as a way of bringing relief to consumers. Not every country did that, and in the case of Grenada, the consumption tax was quite high, and so they put a cap of $15, and subsequently they removed the consumption tax for a period of 3 months in the first instance. And so countries have the latitude to use whatever policy measures that they have at their disposal to bring relief to the consumers when it is warranted. So price caps are not the norm, but in the case of rapidly increasing prices, then that is an option that governments have at their disposal.
Now, we've been discussing fuel in terms of diesel and gasoline primarily, but a big part of our everyday lives is the LPG, that's the cooking gas that we use. Are similar pricing mechanisms in place for calculating what we pay as consumers for LPG?
Well, LPG can be broken down into the small cylinder, the 20 pounds, and the large cylinder, the 100 pounds, right? You have some in between, but generally it's 20 pounds and 100 pounds. So governments across the region, in a lot of cases, they've subsidized the 20-pound cylinder of LPG. Generally, consumers pay the full price for the 100-pound cylinders because generally it is thought that persons who have the means who have, maybe middle income and higher are the ones who would generally buy the 100-pound cylinders. And so they don't need as much help as the other persons who generally buy the 20-pound cylinders. So in terms of targeting a subsidy, governments tend to target a 20-pound cylinder. And so you find the differences in prices across the region are not that huge. But you find huge differences in a 100-pound cylinder, especially in the case of St. Kitts and Nevis, which heavily subsidizes that category of LPG, that 100-pound cylinder. So in St. Kitts and Nevis, we pay about $140 per 100-pound cylinder. In other islands, they pay in excess of $250 for the same 100-pound cylinder because it is not an area that governments target as a subsidy or target to subsidize, as I said earlier, because in the grand scheme of things, persons who can afford it will buy the larger cylinder. So it's a policy decision by the government of St. Kitts and Nevis. I think Antigua also subsidizes it to a certain extent. It's a policy decision, and you have to have the fiscal space. You have to have the money, basically, right? In the layman's terms,
able to extend that subsidy.
Able to extend that subsidy, and prices have been fixed at $140 in St. Kitts for over 19 years now. So, irrespective of what's happening on international markets, the government has made a decision that our residents are not going to pay over in excess of $140 for a cylinder of LPG, and that's a way of bringing relief to persons, especially those persons who have their little operations on the side of the road. They do their jerk chicken and whatnot. They know that the price of their cooking gas is not going to increase. So it's a policy decision by the government, but you have to have the fiscal space to do that. You have to have the resources to do that. And in the case of St. Kitts and Nevis, they do have the resources. A lot of it is funded, I guess, by CBI inflows. And so that's one of the areas in which they decided to utilize some of their CBI funds for the benefit of the wider population. Not every government has that flexibility or that latitude, but most governments do subsidize the 20-pound cylinder, as those are the ones that are mainly used by persons in low-income categories.
Leon, you've outlined the different fuel pricing mechanisms that, as we discussed, governments use. What are some of the benefits that the different systems, as you said, the full pass-through and a partial pass-through, what are some of the benefits that these different systems afford the governments in the ECCU?
So in the case of the full pass-through, one of the disadvantages is that the consumers face the full brunt of the price increases, right? So while that may be seen as a disadvantage, the advantage is that they change their behavior. It causes them to change their behavior almost immediately, right? If you know your gasoline went from $13 to $19,
You will adjust.
You will adjust. You know, if it goes from 13 to 14, maybe not so much. You still go on your joyride, you might drive around the island, go lambing, whatever, not think much about the price of gasoline. But if you know you're facing $19 from $13, you would think twice about making that trip, right? The moving average system, the partial moving average system, it has a similar effect, but it's just not as strong. So, as I said earlier, it sends the right signals to the consumers that, hey, prices are increasing, but you're not feeling the full brunt of it just yet. It'll take a while before it gets there, right? So it kind of gives you a little bit more time to adjust your behavior as opposed to the full pass-through where you have to adjust almost instantly, right? So that's one of the advantages, I guess, in that consumers don't feel they don't face the full brunt of price increases. On the flip side of that, though, sometimes governments have to end up subsidizing the price at the pump. Especially, let's say, in a situation where the retail price should be $16, but because of the moving average system or the partial pass-through, what consumers end up paying is, say, $14. There's a $2 difference that needs to be, refunded or accounted for.
Correct.
And so sometimes it involves some reimbursement to the wholesalers or the retailers so that, they can get the full amount that is due to them. So sometimes there's a netting off of resources. Whatever the retailers may owe the government is netted off against what the government may owe them. So that happens sometimes. In a full pass-through, you don't have that headache because everything is passed through. I don't owe you anything, you don't owe me anything, right? And so, like I said, both systems send the right signals to the consumers. It's just that one signal is much stronger than the other.
The other one is a little bit more delayed.
A little bit more delayed. And, it makes it a little bit more palatable to the consumer. Price went from 13 to 14.50. Okay, it's an increase, but I can handle that. 150 per gallon extra, 10 gallons, I can handle that. Yes. But if it goes from 13 to 19, that's a $6 difference, and you're putting $10.
Significant, yes.
That's a big difference. That's $60 extra that you're putting that you have to pay for your gasoline.
What pertains on the international market generally? For instance, our neighbors in North America and the United States. Is it that they use a pass-through system generally vis-a-vis what we do here in the Caribbean?
Generally, it's a full pass-through. But the advantage that they have is that they have reserves, right? They can tap into special reserves that they have.
They actually produce, because they actually produce some of this fuel.
Fuel, right? So, and they have reserves that they store in certain unspecified places that they can tap into to supplement the supply on the domestic market, which could bring the prices down. So they do have certain levers that we don't. I mean, we are totally dependent on fuel, on gasoline and diesel and so forth. And this is why I guess we're making that push towards renewable energy, because we want to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels.
Leon, thank you for speaking with us on ECCB Connects. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed my time here.
And now for this week's financial tip.
Use credit wisely. It can be great help, but don't take on more than you can handle.
We've come to the end of this episode of ECCB Connects.
On today's program, we discussed that the price of fuel in the ECCU is influenced by a number of factors, including geopolitical events such as the ongoing war in Ukraine, the international price of crude oil, government taxes and levies, government subsidies and price caps, as well as government pricing regimes, including the pass-through system.
Thanks for watching, and be sure to join us next week when we bring you another episode of ECCB Connects.